Did you know that prolonged trauma during childhood can lead to PTSD? In this video, we'll be exploring the intricate connection between childhood trauma and the development of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It's essential to understand that childhood is a critical period of development where experiences deeply impact emotional regulation, cognitive patterns, and identity formation. Enduring trauma during this time can disrupt this critical growth, laying the groundwork for the complexities seen in PTSD. We'll delve into how prolonged stress can affect brain development, particularly areas responsible for stress responses. We'll also discuss how trauma can disrupt secure attachments, affecting trust and relationships throughout life, and leading to difficulties in emotional regulation and the formation of maladaptive coping mechanisms. Ultimately, we'll explore how these factors increase the vulnerability for developing PTSD later in life. Now let's dive into how childhood trauma can affect the brain's development. To understand PTSD, we must first understand how trauma impacts a developing brain. Picture the brain as a complex, intricate city with various regions responsible for different functions. When trauma occurs, especially during the critical period of childhood, it's like a storm passing over this city, disrupting its normal functions and potentially changing its very landscape. The storm of prolonged trauma can lead to significant neurobiological changes. For instance, the brain regions responsible for our stress response, like the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex, can be altered. The amygdala, our alarm system for threats, might become overactive, making the child hypersensitive to stressors. On the other hand, the prefrontal cortex, which helps manage our reactions to stress, might be underdeveloped, making it harder to regulate these responses. This combination can lead to a heightened stress response. Children exposed to chronic trauma might become persistently aroused or hypervigilant, constantly on the lookout for danger. It's like living in a city that's perpetually on high alert, where sirens never cease, and citizens are always bracing for the next storm. But it's not just about the storms or the immediate response to them. The long-term effects of these neurobiological changes can be profound. Prolonged trauma can disrupt the brain's development, leading to potential difficulties with memory, attention, and emotional regulation. It's like the city's infrastructure is damaged, affecting its day-to-day operations and the well-being of its inhabitants. So you see, the impact of trauma on a developing brain is far-reaching. It's not just about the immediate reaction to a traumatic event, but the long-term changes that can influence a child's behavior, emotions, and overall well-being. And these changes can lay the groundwork for future mental health conditions, including PTSD. With these changes in the brain, the way children form attachments can also be affected. But that's a story for another scene. For now, let's remember that understanding the impact of trauma on the brain is a crucial step towards understanding PTSD and its complexities. Trauma during childhood can have a significant impact on how we form relationships. This statement rings true for many survivors of childhood trauma. The relationships we form during our early years are the building blocks for all future relationships. But what happens when these foundational years are marred by trauma? Imagine attachment as a blueprint for how we relate to others. This blueprint is first sketched out in our earliest relationships, typically with our caregivers. A child who experiences consistent, nurturing care tends to develop a secure attachment pattern. They learn to trust others and believe that they're worthy of love and care. However, when a child experiences trauma, this blueprint can be disrupted. The child may develop an insecure attachment pattern. They might become overly clingy and anxious, always fearing abandonment. Or they may swing the other way, becoming distant and avoidant, fearful of getting too close. Some children oscillate between these two extremes, never sure of where they stand. This inconsistent attachment pattern can be very confusing and stressful. As these children grow into adults, their disrupted attachment patterns can affect their ability to form healthy, secure relationships. They might struggle with trust, intimacy, and communication. They may also have a heightened fear of rejection or abandonment, which can create a self-fulfilling prophecy. They push people away out of fear of being hurt, which can lead to the very rejection they were afraid of. But it's essential to remember that our attachment patterns aren't set in stone. With awareness, understanding, and therapeutic support, it's possible to develop more secure attachment patterns. Therapy can provide a corrective emotional experience, giving individuals a chance to explore and understand their attachment patterns. It can also provide tools to help manage the fear and anxiety that can come with forming close relationships. In essence, trauma can profoundly impact our attachment patterns, affecting how we form and maintain relationships throughout our lives. But with understanding and support, individuals can learn to navigate these challenges and form healthier, more secure relationships. But attachment patterns aren't the only thing affected by childhood trauma. Prolonged trauma can also lead to difficulties in emotional regulation and self-perception. Let's first talk about emotional regulation. This is our ability to manage and respond to an emotional experience in a socially acceptable way. But what happens when a child experiences prolonged trauma? Their emotional regulation system can become disrupted. This can lead to intense emotional responses or rapid mood swings. They might react strongly to situations that others might consider minor, or they might struggle to express their emotions in an appropriate manner. But children are resilient, right? They adapt. And so, they might develop maladaptive coping mechanisms to deal with these overwhelming emotions. This can include strategies like dissociation, where they disconnect from their thoughts, feelings, or sense of identity, or avoidance, where they steer clear of reminders of their trauma. While these mechanisms may help them cope in the short term, they can be harmful in the long run, limiting their ability to fully engage with life. Now let's move on to self-perception. Our perception of ourselves, our abilities, and our worth forms the foundation of our identity. But prolonged trauma can distort this self-perception. Children exposed to chronic trauma might develop negative self-beliefs like, "I am not worthy," or "I am not lovable." They might struggle with low self-esteem, which can persist into adulthood. Additionally, trauma can hinder the development of a coherent self-identity. This can lead to confusion or a fragmentation of the self. They might find it hard to answer the question, "Who am I?" Their sense of self might be closely tied to their traumatic experiences, making it challenging to separate their identity from their trauma. All these factors, emotional dysregulation, maladaptive coping mechanisms, and distorted self-perception, are not isolated. They interact with each other, creating a complex web that can make healing from trauma challenging. But it's crucial to remember, understanding these impacts is the first step towards healing, and most importantly, they can increase the risk of developing CPTSD later in life. So, how does all this lead to CPTSD, you may ask? Well, to answer that, we must dive into the intricate relationship between prolonged childhood trauma and the increased risk for complex post-traumatic stress disorder. When we explore this connection, we find that the impacts of enduring trauma during childhood can lay the groundwork for CPTSD. Remember, childhood is a sensitive developmental period. When this period is marred by prolonged trauma, it disrupts the healthy development, affecting both the brain's architecture and emotional regulation systems. These disruptions can lead to neurobiological changes, such as altered brain development and heightened stress responses. Areas of the brain responsible for stress response, like the amygdala and prefrontal cortex, can be particularly affected. The result? Children exposed to chronic trauma may develop hypersensitivity to stressors, leading to persistent arousal or hypervigilance. Let's not forget the impact on attachment and relationship patterns. Trauma can hinder the establishment of secure attachments, affecting trust and relationships throughout life. Consequently, children with traumatic experiences might struggle with intimacy and trust, and forming healthy relationships can become a daunting task due to disrupted attachment patterns. Moreover, the emotional dysregulation and maladaptive coping mechanisms that stem from prolonged trauma can lead to intense emotional responses or mood swings. Children might develop coping strategies like dissociation or avoidance to deal with overwhelming emotions. Then there's the issue of identity and self-perception. Chronic trauma in childhood can distort one's self-perception and sense of worth, leading to negative self-beliefs and low self-esteem. It can also hinder the development of a coherent self-identity, causing confusion or fragmentation of the self. So when we consider all these factors, we see how prolonged trauma in childhood significantly increases the risk of developing CPTSD later in life. The pervasive and enduring nature of the trauma's impact creates a vulnerability that can lay the groundwork for complex PTSD. Understanding these impacts is crucial for comprehending the depth of the condition and its origins. By recognizing these connections, we can better support those affected and work towards more effective treatments and interventions. So, we see how childhood trauma can have far-reaching effects into adulthood. It disrupts the sensitive developmental stage, altering the architecture of the brain and emotional regulation systems. This leads to heightened stress responses, difficulties in forming secure attachments, and challenges in emotional regulation. all of which can deeply affect the individual's self-perception and identity. Children exposed to prolonged trauma are at a significantly increased risk of developing complex PTSD later in life due to the pervasive and enduring nature of the trauma's impact. These effects underpin the complexities seen in CPTSD, and understanding them is critical for comprehending the depth of the condition and its origins. By summarizing these key points, we hope to emphasize the importance of understanding and acknowledging the origins of CPTSD. Knowledge is power, and by understanding the impact of childhood trauma, we can better support those living with CPTSD.